All right, strap in, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive into a case that's as fascinating as it is chilling.
Okay, I'm intrigued already.
It's the Stephanie Lazarus interrogation. You might remember this one. Lazarus was an LAPD detective, no less, and she was ultimately convicted of murdering her ex-boyfriend's wife, Sherri Rasmussen.
Oh, wow, that's right. I remember that case. What makes this deep dive so special?
Well, we've got a fantastic YouTube video from JCS Criminal Psychology that breaks down the whole thing. And it's amazing to see how the detectives used subtle psychological tactics to get Lazarus to reveal incriminating information.
That's wild, especially since she was a seasoned police officer herself.
Yeah.
They had to be really clever.
Absolutely. The video really emphasizes how they started by using a ruse, telling Lazarus they needed her expertise on an art theft
Oh,
case.
smart. Bring her in without raising any suspicion.
Precisely. It allowed them to get her into an interrogation room without her even realizing what was going on. And they even managed to take her gun, all under the guise of confidentiality. It's a bit like they used her knowledge of police procedure against her.
Kind of trap, using her own expertise against her.
Mhm.
That's fascinating. So how did they start to break down her story?
Well, early on, they casually mentioned the victim's husband, John Ruetten, who, as you'll recall, was Lazarus's ex-boyfriend. But they mispronounced his name just slightly.
Really? How come?
It's a classic interrogation technique. By mispronouncing the name, they were trying to see if Lazarus would react in any way. Like a subtle sign of recognition or hesitation, kind of like a little test to gauge her truthfulness.
And did she? Catch the mispronunciation, I mean.
That's where things get interesting. There was a noticeable delay in her response, which is, a bit odd, considering this was someone she supposedly dated for several years. Wouldn't you think she'd instantly recognize his name, even if it was mispronounced?
Yeah, you'd think so. It makes you wonder if she was trying to distance herself from him, like subconsciously downplaying their connection.
Exactly. And that feeling is amplified when they start digging into the details of their relationship. Lazarus consistently downplays their closeness and tries to control the narrative. It's almost like she's trying to paint a picture of a casual fling, something insignificant.
I see. So she's trying to steer the conversation away from anything incriminating. Did she slip up at all?
Oh, there are a few interesting moments. Like, she used vague language a lot, saying things like gosh and God, as if she was struggling to remember. It's quite a contrast, isn't it? She can recall vivid details about other things, like her college years or meeting her husband years later. But when it comes to Ruetten, it's all foggy.
Wow, that's fascinating. It seems like she's trying to manipulate the conversation to keep the focus off of her relationship with Ruetten. But I bet the detectives didn't miss a beat.
Not a chance. They were carefully observing her every move, her body language, everything. And they noticed that her body language often contradicted her words, especially when they pressed her for specifics about Ruetten.
It's like her body was betraying her true feelings, even if she was trying to hide them.
So what did the detectives do with that information?
Well, this is where the video introduces this really interesting concept called terror management theory. Have you ever heard of it?
I'm not sure. Refresh my memory.
It basically suggests that when people are confronted with a major threat, like the possibility of being exposed for a crime, they'll often go off on tangents or give excessive detail about irrelevant things.
That's really interesting. So it's like a coping mechanism almost.
Exactly. A subconscious way to manage the fear and anxiety of the situation.
That makes a lot of sense. Our brains are always trying to protect us, even if it means distorting reality a little bit. So, did Lazarus exhibit this behavior in the interrogation? Oh, absolutely. She rambles about her college years, meeting her husband, even scanning old photographs, all totally unrelated to the art theft case. It's almost like her mind is racing, desperately searching for anything to distract from the uncomfortable line of questioning.
That's a great way to put it. Her behavior is screaming, "Look over there," while the detectives are zeroing in on the real issue.
Yeah.
So they must have been picking up on all of this, right?
You bet. They're like psychological detectives piecing together the puzzle of her behavior to uncover the truth. And they use her expertise against her, playing on her understanding of police procedure, her sense of professionalism, almost like they're lulling her into this false sense of security.
It's almost like they're speaking her language, using her own training to break down her defenses. Pretty brilliant when you think about it. Did she ever catch on to what they were doing?
Well, she keeps asking, what's this all about? Trying to regain control of the situation. But the detectives just deflect her questions, keeping her off balance.
A verbal chess match. It's like they're always one step ahead, carefully guiding the conversation while studying her every reaction. What an incredible skill. These detectives are amazing.
It's a true testament to their expertise. I mean, they're not just looking for a confession, they're searching for those tiny cracks in her story, those little behavioral cues that reveal the truth.
And they're doing it masterfully. This deep dive is already so captivating. What else can we expect?
Well, we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack in this case. And next time, we're going to explore some of the other evidence that helped seal Lazarus's fate.
Okay, I'm hooked. I can't wait to see what other secrets this case holds.
Stay tuned, because in the next part, things get even more intense. Wow, that DNA request really was a game changer, wasn't it? It just completely shifted the whole dynamic of the interrogation.
Yeah, talk about turning up the heat. But remember, the interrogation is just one part of this story. There's a whole lot more that helped to convict Lazarus.
Oh, right. You mentioned witness testimonies before. What can you tell me about those?
We'll get this. The video talks about how that's right, 8 separate witnesses placed Lazarus at the hospital where Sherri Rasmussen worked.
Hold on, she went to Rasmussen's workplace. That's pretty bold for someone trying to stay off the radar.
You'd think so, right? And it wasn't just a quick visit either. The witnesses described it as an actual confrontation, a heated one, with Lazarus being super aggressive toward Rasmussen.
Whoa, okay. That's a completely different picture from the one she tried to paint in the interrogation room. Remember, all calm and collected.
Totally. These witness accounts point to some serious bad blood between Lazarus and Rasmussen, like jealousy, wanting to eliminate a romantic rival.
And let's not forget, Lazarus was a police officer. She knew the risks. She knew how investigations work. So why would she risk a confrontation like that?
It's a good question. It really speaks to how powerful her emotions must have been. And it gets worse. Some reports say she even threatened Rasmussen's life during this confrontation.
So we're not just talking about a random act of violence here. This seems like it was planned.
That's what the prosecution argued. They said Lazarus was driven by this cocktail of jealousy and this desire to get rid of the woman she saw as an obstacle to her happiness with John Ruetten.
It's actually pretty scary how calculated it seems, especially considering her job. You'd expect a police officer to have a strong sense of, right and wrong.
It just goes to show you, anyone can be driven by dark impulses. It doesn't matter what your job is or your social status. This case really shows how complicated human nature is,
Yeah.
The line between good and evil can get pretty blurry.
Yeah, it's like that saying, you can't judge a book by its cover. Lazarus looked like this respected law enforcement officer on the outside, but underneath it all, a whole other story.
Exactly. It's a textbook example of deception and manipulation. And it reminds us that we can't just focus on how people present themselves. We've got to consider what drives their actions, their true motivations.
So we've got the witness testimonies and the interrogation tactics, but what about other evidence? Was there anything that directly linked Lazarus to the crime scene?
That's where the power of forensic science comes in. Remember how the detectives pushed Lazarus for that DNA sample? Well, that was a real turning point in the case.
So they were able to match her DNA to something found at the crime scene.
Bingo. The video explained how DNA technology had come a long way since the murder. They tested the sample Lazarus gave them, and boom, it matched DNA found on a bite mark on Rasmussen's arm.
Wow, that's undeniable evidence. It's like science finally caught up with her after all those years.
It really shows how forensic science can change everything in criminal investigations. And it also highlights why it's so important to keep looking at cold cases with fresh eyes and new tech.
Makes you think, how many other unsolved cases are out there just waiting for technology to catch up?
A lot, probably. It's a good reminder to never give up hope for justice, even in cases that have been cold for years, decades even.
Thinking about it, Lazarus must have been carrying that secret around for 25 years. That's a heavy burden.
I can only imagine the toll it took on her, mentally and emotionally. To live a normal life while hiding something so dark, it's almost impossible to grasp.
And to think, she might have gotten away with it if DNA technology hadn't advanced so much.
It's a chilling thought, but true. Truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener so far, but I gotta say, I'm left with a lot of questions. Like, how did Lazarus manage to stay under the radar for so long?
Well, some people think her job as a police officer might have shielded her a bit. Like, maybe the investigators initially didn't consider her a suspect because of her badge.
That's unsettling to think someone might get special treatment just because they're a cop. It goes against everything we believe in about fairness and justice.
Yeah, it raises some serious concerns about potential bias in the justice system.
Yeah.
And it underscores the importance of making sure everyone, regardless of their profession or who they know, is treated equally under the law.
And what about the impact on the LAPD? Their reputation must have taken a hit after this.
No doubt. The video talks about how the case triggered internal investigations and some changes to LAPD policies. They were trying to figure out how Lazarus managed to slip through the cracks for so long.
It's a stark reminder that no institution is perfect. There's always the potential for corruption or abuse of power. We have to hold individuals accountable for their actions, no matter who they are or what their position is. I'm also curious about John Ruetten. How did he react to all of this?
The video mentions that Ruetten gave this really powerful statement at Lazarus' sentencing. He talked about the pain of losing his wife and how he felt betrayed, knowing someone he knew had done it.
That must have been absolutely devastating for him, losing his wife and then finding out it was someone he trusted. It's heartbreaking.
It really highlights how acts of violence have a ripple effect. They don't just impact the victim. They leave scars on families, friends, whole communities.
Yeah, those scars can take a lifetime to heal. And in this case, there's this extra layer of betrayal and deception, which makes healing even harder. It's a lot to process, this whole case. It makes you think about how well you can really know another person and how easy it is to be betrayed by someone you trust.
It's a sobering thought. It reminds us to stay aware, trust our gut feelings, and be careful about who we let into our lives.
So we've gone down this path of deception, betrayal, and eventually justice, even though it was delayed. It's been an incredible look into the dark side of human nature and how complicated the justice system can be.
And even though it's a dark and tragic story, there's a little bit of hope there too. The fact that Lazarus was finally held accountable, even after all these years, shows that the truth can come out, even in the toughest cases.
It speaks volumes about the dedication of law enforcement, the advancements in science, and the relentless pursuit of justice for victims and their families.
It's been a wild ride, this deep dive. From shock and disbelief to anger and sadness, and in the end, a sense of relief that justice was done.
As we wrap up this part of our exploration, there's one more crucial piece we need to talk about: the psychological impact on everyone involved. The families, the investigators, even Lazarus herself.
Right. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at the lasting consequences of this crime and what the Stephanie Lazarus case means for society as a whole.
Be sure to join us for the final part, where we'll explore the psychological aftermath and the enduring legacy of this truly captivating case. It's incredible, isn't it? To think that Lazarus lived this double life for so long, hiding this huge secret while working as a police officer.
It really is. Talk about compartmentalization. I mean, she managed to keep her past hidden from everyone, her colleagues, friends, all while moving up the ranks in the LAPD.
Makes you wonder, did she ever feel guilty during those years? Did she ever think about confessing?
That's a tough question to answer. We can only guess, really.
Yeah.
The video does mention, though, how mentally and emotionally draining it must have been for her to keep up that act for over 20 years. That constant fear of exposure.
It must have been exhausting, right? Living with that weight, always wondering if she'd be found out.
And she was, eventually. But let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about Sherri Rasmussen, but what about the people she left behind? How do they cope with all of this?
Well, the video talks about John Ruetten's statement at Lazarus' sentencing. He spoke about the pain, the devastation of losing his wife, and then learning that someone he knew was responsible.
It was a very powerful statement. He described Sherri as this vibrant, loving person who was robbed of her future. He spoke about feeling empty, betrayed.
I can't even imagine that feeling. To lose your wife and then discover it was someone you knew who took her from you. And while he was trying to rebuild his life, Lazarus was just living hers as if nothing had happened.
It really underscores the impact of violent crime. It doesn't stop with the victim. Families, friends, entire communities are affected.
And the trauma can linger for years. Losing someone to violence can have lasting psychological and emotional consequences.
Absolutely. And in this case, there's this added element of betrayal, deceit, which can make healing even more difficult.
What about the impact on the LAPD? Having one of their own convicted of murder must have been a huge blow to the department.
It definitely was.
Right.
The video mentions how the case triggered a bunch of internal investigations and policy changes within the LAPD. They were trying to figure out how Lazarus had managed to avoid suspicion for so long.
It really makes you think about accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
How could someone who committed such a terrible crime continue to work as a police officer for all those years?
It's a valid question. It highlights the need for constant scrutiny and reform in law enforcement, not just in LA, but everywhere. People need to be able to trust that those who are supposed to uphold the law are being held to the highest standards.
This case really shows that no institution is above the law. Everyone, no matter their job or status, needs to be held accountable for their actions.
It's also a reminder that justice can prevail, even if it takes time. Lazarus's conviction gave Sherri Rasmussen's loved ones some sense of closure. It showed that even those who try to bury their past can be held responsible.
It's been quite an emotional roller coaster, hasn't it? Exploring the darker sides of human nature, the complexities of the justice system, and then, of course, the consequences of violence and betrayal. What are your final thoughts on this case?
I think it serves as a warning. Appearances can deceive, power can be abused, and the pursuit of justice is a never-ending battle.
It also reminds us to stay alert, to question authority, and to push for transparency and accountability in institutions that hold so much power.
And most importantly, we can't forget the victims. Sherri Rasmussen's life was cut short, but her story continues to inspire us to fight for justice, to stand up to those in power, and to remember those who have been silenced.
Thank you for taking us through this case. It's been a fascinating journey into the human mind, the flaws in our systems, and the strength of truth.
It's been my pleasure. And to everyone listening, I highly recommend watching the full video on the JCS Criminal Psychology channel. It's definitely worth your time.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. What are your thoughts on the Stephanie Lazarus case? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.